This is your government video for centralization and decentralization. The power split between the federal government and the state government can also be seen as preferring a centralized or federal government, or decentralization, which means splitting it up and spreading it out, decentralizing the power. And so we're going to look at the benefits to each of these points of view. So we're going to start with centralization. People who want to centralize power into one government authority generally prefer federal government because it's easier for the federal government to create laws which are uniform throughout the country. If you believe it's important for everybody to be abiding by the same laws and have the same punishments if they break those laws and to be treated the same by government, it's far easier to do that with uniform laws throughout the country. Some people also believe that if the government is imposing those laws equally, then we are therefore treated with more equality. If laws are different from place to place, punishments are different from place to place, then suddenly some people are getting more benefits than others, and some people would say that that's unequal. Centralized power also prevents what's referred to as racing to the bottom, or what the founding fathers referred to as tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is an economic argument that we will also talk about in economics class. Racing to the bottom, basically, here's an example. Let's say that a person owns a factory, and this factory employs a lot of people, but it also has to pollute the air. Its smokestacks emit lots of pollution into the air to the places around them. If every individual state is allowed to have their own laws about pollution, then all of the factories who need to pollute a lot to make their product are all going to move to the state that has the least amount of laws and regulations on it. Why? Because it's cheaper. You don't have to pay to clean up your pollution mess when you've produced your product. So what happens is there ends up being a state, or maybe even a city within a state, where all these polluting factories move. And then suddenly the people that live in that area have lots of lung problems, they have childhood asthma, their healthcare insurance rises, all sorts of negative effects. We call these negative externalities happen. This is racing to the bottom. If the laws are different everywhere, some people who need to do things which have bad consequences go and do that thing in the state where the consequences are the cheapest for them. Centralists would also say that we can preserve our resources better. If the federal government wants us to preserve, let's say, oil resources, then they can create federal laws banning drilling for oil on land, and therefore we can keep our oil reserves fresh and use them for the future. But if it's up to each state, now there's competition between each state to make as much profit off of that particular resource compared to the other states. Centralists also often believe that the Constitution was created by people, by individuals, because the citizens themselves had to ratify the Constitution by voting in each of the 13 states. And therefore, the rights in the Constitution should protect citizens, not state governments. Decentralists are people that prefer states' rights because the power is split into a whole bunch of more decentralized or smaller various governments which can differ from place to place. And the biggest argument for decentralization is called experimenting or experimentation. Each individual state serves as an experimentation lab. We can see what happens within a state if they decide to pass some type of law. So if you take the example of legalized recreational marijuana, the city of Denver was the first city to pass a law legalizing its use, and then the state of Colorado was pretty quick after to pass a state law. Now, a bunch of other states weren't really sure if they wanted to have marijuana legalized, but they could look at Colorado as an experiment, see what the effects were. A lot of people were concerned that if you legalize marijuana, you'd suddenly get more stronger drug addiction, like opioid deaths. Maybe you'd get more DUIs and people getting in things like traffic accidents or harming themselves on drugs. And They also were wondering what the positive benefits were. How much tax revenue is coming in? Are tourists going to Colorado specifically for the use of marijuana? And so we can look at that experiment in Colorado, and then if states like what they see with the effects of that law, then they can implement it in their own state, which we're starting to see throughout the country. But this allows us to implement laws state by state, a little at a time. It is far easier to do it that way because if you pass a federal law and it goes into effect everywhere and it turns out to be a bad law, it's really difficult to roll it back or change it. Decentralists also like state government because it's closer to the people. You can go to your state capital fairly easily. Certainly at the time the Constitution was written, Washington, D.C. was far more difficult to reach because transportation and communication issues. So it was easier to get to know people who were in your state government, and you could check and balance them by going to see what kinds of laws they're passing. State governments also help us to check and balance the federal government, and that diffuses the power across multiple checks and balances or federalism. So if you really believe that the federal government can become tyrannical and take away your rights, one of the best ways to check and balance that is by diffusing the power into state governments. Decentralists and states' rights proponents also believe that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution gives them broad powers, and they're not wrong. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which is the last in the Bill of Rights, says that all powers not enumerated for the federal government belong to the states. So the 10th Amendment is known as reserved for states' rights. And there is a section in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, where there's literally a list of the things the federal government's in charge of. And then the 10th Amendment says if it's not on that list, states can do whatever they want. And because that list is limited, they thought that writing this 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights would restrict the federal government to only doing those things. Now, we know that over time, the federal government has gotten much larger than it ever was or ever even was perceived of by our founding fathers. But the 10th Amendment does give states broad powers. Decentralists also believe that the Constitution was created by state governments, and the state governments had to approve or ratify, and they needed 9 of the 13 states to ratify the new Constitution. And yes, most states decided to put it up to a vote of their citizens, but ultimately it was the state legislature's idea whether to pass the new Constitution or not.